Thank you for joining Community Planning Conversations. Today's guests are here as part of the 8th Annual Planning Institute that's sponsored by the Department of Urban and Regional Planning at the university. My first guest is Dan Pitera, and Dan is an architect and is associated with the School of Architecture at the University of Detroit Mercy School of Architecture. And Cheryl Morgan is my second guest, and Cheryl is at the School of Architecture, Auburn University in Alabama. I'm going to hold up information about the two organizations within their respective schools of architecture that they direct. This is the Detroit Collaborative Design Center, and Dan will talk a great deal about their projects. And the second one is the Auburn Urban Studio, and Cheryl Morgan directs this studio. And the studio, even though the university is in Auburn, Alabama, the studio is located in Birmingham, Alabama. Thank you both for joining me today, and I just will ask Dan to very briefly describe what your program does and all of the outreach that you're involved in.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here today. Our office is within the School of Architecture at the University of Detroit Mercy. We are essentially a fully operational architectural planning and landscape office in the school. We work with communities in a very particular participatory process where we try to not be someone who comes into a community and say what needs to be done. We actually design based on what the community feels should be done. We bring an expertise of design, but we do not live in the communities that we work in. So it's very important for the communities themselves to be a part of the regeneration of each community. So we're very interested in how participation occurs in a meaningful way, not just in a superficial way. So we work in a variety of processes that allow for participation to reach varied people in the way and how they operate in terms, if they are shy, if they're less shy. We try to incorporate processes and that incorporate as many types of people and varied, diverse people.
Cheryl.
Yes.
Tell us a bit about the Urban Studio in Birmingham.
Well, we operate not only in Birmingham, we work with neighborhoods and communities in Birmingham, but we're also an outreach arm of the university and our School of Architecture across the state. So we've worked with more than 40 towns and communities in the state of Alabama. And we are also very participatory, grassroots. We bring our expertise, but one of the things that we find, particularly in the small towns and the neighborhoods within the larger cities that we work in, is people need to be empowered to know that they have things that are worth working with. So we have a concept of assets-based planning. It's a very normal process, but we believe that you start by saying what's good in your community. And it's fascinating how many communities don't know they have anything good. Mm-hmm. Particularly in the South, we're often very, as I say, pitiful. We often see what's bad first. And of course, it's easy to be overwhelmed by that and to give up and to not think that there's any potential to change things. And for us, focusing initially on what's good, what's distinct, what's important about the community. And sometimes that can be something very, very small, but it's tangible and helps them begin to have a perspective about opportunity and potential as opposed to what can't be. And the other thing we have in the Deep South is a saying called "fixin' to get ready to." And it's everybody in the South knows what I mean when I say that. But for us, we go into a community and we say, okay, that's about 3 layers of procrastination. You're fixing to get ready to, and we're help
That's
you
good. Mm-hmm.
get
Good.
past fixing.
Mm-hmm.
Because in many, many communities, that's what they've been doing. They've been fixing things as opposed to dealing with the bigger picture and the set of opportunities. And so one of the most important things we bring besides our expertise is fresh eyes and an enthusiasm for the special things in a community. And we find that that's really, really exciting. I often bring students to communities and they go, oh my gosh, why did you bring us here? And then they begin to look around and they find the historic cemetery. They find, of course, with architecture students, they're fascinated by the abandoned grist mill. They find the buildings that the folks in the community see as blight. They really are in a certain way. But we begin to see what do those represent as assets to build things in the community. The other thing is we find that many communities are actually doing good things, but they're not organized in any way that give them momentum, that give them a kind of critical synergy to move the community forward. So one of the things, of course, we advocate is planning. The notion of looking to how do you orchestrate and leverage what are always limited resources. Every community, whether that's people, money, expertise, how do you leverage what you have and move it forward?
You've opened up so much for our conversation, but I want to capture one thing that you just mentioned to anchor it here in the Midwest. You're talking about communities not realizing what asset might already exist. I was telling them that I had recently discovered a community in Indiana, Reynolds, Indiana. You can Google it on the internet. It's a community of 550 people, and they now have gotten themselves off the grid, totally sustainable. And the way they've captured that is they're surrounded by hog farms, and they've captured the methane, and they're using that for their energy, whereas most communities look at hog farms as smelly and a very unwanted entity to be added to their community. This community sort of has turned the table and turned it into really an economic development plus, in that they're saving the cost of their energy within the community. So it's not just the South, but we can bring it back to the Midwest, and Dan will bring it back to the Midwest a great deal with his comments on Detroit. What I'd like to start our conversation with, and then Dan will show us some of the pictures of Detroit so that people will get a perspective on how much area that you are looking at, and the entity of empty buildings related to other cities across the country. That just is a visual to help us focus. But you do things differently, but the same context of trying to engage people within the community, whether they're stakeholders or what we would say as citizens who have not normally been active. How do you do this? This is really hard, and we all can learn from your successes. So Dan, how do you do this in Detroit and the other communities you go to?
We never go into the community. We must be invited into the community first. So key to that is then word of mouth. Because of the work that we've done, that is one way that we've done good work, but also because we are active in the community in a variety of ways. We're on boards, we are at concerts, we're at jazz festivals, we're present in some ways. So the first thing is just being present in the community and participating in the community. So that's the one key thing. The second is that... And
can I ask, are most of the communities that you so far have been involved in within a certain distance from Detroit? This is how they're learning, or have you now, people know about you, so you are spreading across the country geographically?
We're getting offers to do projects all around the United States. About 95% of the projects that we're doing are in Detroit. That we're committed to working in Detroit. We've done a couple in Los Angeles and New York, but there's only a certain amount of engagement that you can do in a place like that. So because of the distance. So what we try to do when we're working in neighborhoods that are not nearby to us, we then partner with a firm or an organization within the neighborhood in Los Angeles and New York and help impart the participatory process there. So then they're actually going through the participatory process with us as advising them in the process. So it helps extend that. But once we are in working with the community and it's trying to set up that what that means by participation, it could be anything from having a dinner, and then from the dinner a dialogue starts. It's not always organized workshops. We do workshops that allow, but the act of participation occurs in having as Cheryl mentioned it wonderfully, in terms of celebrating what is already happening in the community. So we will do things in those areas that are having wonderful conditions happen. So for instance, in a community we just did a master plan for, there's a wonderful space that is now being used for dumping. We had an event at that space to show that actually something there can actually be occur that's good. And from that act, then the design process started developing, saying how do we turn around these inactive spaces into something that's an asset.
And
Well,
what do you and your students do on your 40th project that you just mentioned?
well, because, and I think Dan's point is well taken, when you're going to a community where you don't reside, there is an objectivity that you bring, but also you really, for us, we have to encourage the people who are the natives to tell us what is it that's good and special here. Tell us about what's going on. So we have a methodology of an introductory fact-finding mission. They've seen us out in town taking pictures. They've seen us gathering maps and information. And we bring things like aerial photographs. Most of them have never seen their community from that point of view. And I think one of the things that we bring is that new point of view in all sorts of ways. But then we ask, over a set of questions that we've developed over the years, things that we know help them both begin to have confidence, but also they're kind of slam dunk questions. We ask them, what are your picture postcards? What are the things that are important in your history? And I can't tell you how many times people come away from the meetings going, I didn't know that about my community. And so it begins to build community within the community and help them have an ownership stake in the plan and for it to be their plan. And then as we develop our work, we do a lot of drawing, a lot of illustration, a lot of before and after photographs. I must say we're sort of low tech. We do hand drawings so that people really think they're available to have input.
Well, and they see immediately.
They see immediately.
That is really the key aspect of that. If they say, I don't like this corner, or if we put houses here and the students can draw, then there's that reinforcement.
Exactly.
And we really encourage that kind of input. And a lot of times what's exciting is we don't hear from them when we start showing them things that they're resistive to. It ignites a certain sort of next what if. We'll get much more kind of tools to work with, new pieces on the checkerboard to play with in those, because they start to sense a set of possibilities. Now, occasionally we unearth sacred cows. It's always kind of fun to find that we've suggested maybe a building for renovation, or even to go away because it looked fairly grim to us, and we found out, that's the little dive cafe where everybody had their first kiss after the prom. It's sacred. And then we began to interact with that, and they get a feeling that we want their community to be theirs. I think the other thing is to help them begin to understand in a loving way, if that makes any sense, that some of the patterns of development that they have been trying to do the right thing are not reinforcing the character and quality of place that's important to them. And it's easy to find examples, sometimes anecdotally from other communities, that help them understand how it might work in theirs, or to point out that they really need to be thoughtful about what's going to reinforce the energy and the potential in their community. So those meetings, those interactive sessions, are kind of active classes in a certain way. There's real teaching opportunities there. And because they invite us, and I think that's really important, they're available to those learning. They want to know what to do.
I want to capture that, but Chris now can help us with Dan showing
Yes, yes.
some of those slides on the areas. Do you want to talk
Certainly.
about that and help our viewing audience get a visual of what we're talking about in relationship to how hard it is to do some of the work?
Thank you. When we talk about Detroit, we see, and you see on your screen that Detroit has 138 square miles. It's hard to understand what that really means. And so what we have here, I wanted to show is a sense of 3 other cities or parts of cities that are layered over it. This is New Manhattan on Detroit. You have San Francisco, all of San Francisco on Detroit. And then you have Boston on Detroit. What's curious about this, if you see in your bottom left part of the screen, you have 118 square miles. So you still have 20 square miles left over when you have those cities there. But you'll have 3 million people in those 3 cities, and you only have under 1 million people in Detroit. When Detroit was at its peak population, there was only 1,800,000. So Detroit was sprawl before that was even a term. 85% of the houses in Detroit are single-family homes. And I want to show one more image to show what the implication of that is. The image of this. What is green on your screen? This is a portion of Detroit. It's about 100 square miles that you're seeing. What is green is the area of Detroit that is vacant or abandoned. There are occupied places in those, so it's not entirely vacant or abandoned. But that equals approximately 40 square miles. You could put San Francisco there, and that white image is of San Francisco, which is approximately 46 square miles. So the scale of the issue of this area is quite large. So what we have to ask ourselves is, how do we get down to the individual house, the individual neighborhood? And to pick up on some of the things that that Cheryl was bringing up, we ask our people that are in the workshops and in the events that we have to write narratives. What would they like their place to be like? And literally write it as a story. Not saying that they want to have a grocery store or a community center, but what would they literally be doing 5 years from now, 10 years from now? From that narrative, we extract all of the verbs.
That's interesting.
So we take the verbs. So an architect from Finland, Alva Aalto, once said that architecture should design the verbs of architecture, not the nouns of architecture. That's the difference between
really
designing a
interesting.
stair
Love that.
Yeah, I
and
do too.
designing ascending and descending. What's important there is that we are getting closer to place as opposed to space. As soon as you take in a verb, you're taking on the person and the activities of people. So we are designing from verbs. So when we put a plan and a map in front of a community, we are asking them not to say where the community center is or where the senior center is. We ask them, what are the verbs that you wish to happen? Where are you going to stroll? Where are you going to buy groceries? Where are you going? And think about the verbs that sometimes come through are so much greater than we could ever have imagined. And from that's where we start our design process.
I want the viewing audience to know that Cheryl and I are sitting here nodding our
Yes.
heads and saying, what a great,
Wonderful.
what
Yeah.
a wonderful approach to engage the community, and we're stealing.
Please,
Yeah.
we're going to be stealing both ways.
Yeah.
We're stealing these ideas, and I want to interweave where we are in our conversation. I teach an outreach course also, and one of the learning curves that my students and I have had is engaging a community and judging the community's readiness, in quotes, for us to come in and work with them. So my question then is, you've talked about how you go into the community and start engaging them. Do you have some tools, not necessarily written out, but just checklists in your own heads, with your students of how you judge whether a community is, or if you say to the community, come and talk to us in 3 or 4 months, and giving them a chance to have more conversations within themselves. And whatever you say, I'm stealing, and I'm going to I'm going to use it. So.
Who would like to go
Well,
first on that one?
that's actually a tough one. Why don't you start, Dan?
We are in the process of developing those tools. I wish I could say we have this wonderful tool set up that we use. We believe that what we bring as designers is extremely small part of the process, and we need to be expanding that to include economic development, to be including healthcare, things that are schools, especially in places,
Park
urban
districts.
environments. Is right. So we are looking at for our design center in particular. We're looking at expanding the design center in two different ways. One, to advise people who can actually make changes like that, and to continue to design, but then also develop some of our own work. So we begin to sort of develop prototypes of projects. But then on top of that, when we come into a community and work with being asked to come in and do projects, instead of just bringing planners and architects and landscape architects, to bring an economic development consultant, a marketing consultant, a healthcare consultant that does exist within the university. So to try to create a more holistic plan that we're all sitting around the table, and not just the planners and architects, but we are literally in this stage at this point planning this. So to give you how that's going to work out, in a year from now, I may be able to be a bit more specific.
It's a good start for the conversation. Cheryl.
Yeah, well, and I think that's one of the things that we found very important is we do bring teams of people, and in fact, we don't bring them from our own university. We cross university lines, and we found that's really important.
Oh, okay.
So our economic development person is from the Center for Economic Development at the University of Alabama, and we're a big rivalry state. I think all states are, the two universities. And so the notion that we're not talking about loyalties to a program or a university, this is about the tools that are available to you in the state to help you make differences in your community. And we're a resource, and they begin to identify that you don't have to go one place, you can go lots of places to get that help. I think the other two things that we have found is the first is we identified that there is a real capacity issue. And so leadership building for communities is very important. And we were part of a program called Your Town, Alabama, that was developed on a model.
And let's stop for a moment.
Right.
If you do a search on the internet, just putting in Your Town, Alabama, you will find what she's talking about.
And this is a program that's patterned on a National Trust for Historic Preservation model. They developed it at Syracuse University, or were a grant at Syracuse developed the program. And they had regional centers. Our regional center was at University of Georgia. But we found that it was such an important citizen leadership building tool. It's for not just mayors, but the president of the tree board, the historic preservation board, the people in the community who are trying to do things needed tools, and they needed a sense of sharing with other people in the state who are trying to deal with the same issues. So we've just done, well, I say just, in June we did our 15th Your Town workshop. So 500 people in the state have come together in 3-day workshops over 100 towns and have found out that other people have solved that problem. Here's how you do it. Or other people are struggling with the same problem. Or here's the way you can maneuver this grant application. And we present them with information, resources, and an array of Alabama experts that they can call on. And then they do a hands-on exercise. So they actually do a town that's not any one of them, so they are empowered to see what possibilities. And most importantly, we divide them into 5 teams. There are 5 different solutions to the same town.
Right.
I can't tell you how important it is for them to know there's not
Right.
a right answer.
Right.
There are many ways, and they start with, what's your vision? Now, how do you solve this problem? Instead of, how do you locate the school? And then how do you deal with the Walmart? How do you deal with the bypass? What's your vision? Now, how do you solve that problem? And then the other tool that sounds a little, I think, is we charge for what we do.
Oh, good.
Yeah.
Okay, this is one of the many topics. So both of you talk about how you do that. And one other topic I do want to make sure we talk about is the importance of bringing the students into these communities and how that is such a recharge factor. So let's talk about how you charge for it. Is it through grants, the communities, a combination? Do you have support from your institution in the mix?
Well, for us, the fee is very fundamental. It certainly isn't a fee that in any way competes with our professional planning community.
That's a very important factor.
These are communities that are either not ready to hire a professional planner. They just don't know who to hire. They don't know what they need yet. Or they literally will not have the resources to hire a professional planner.
Correct.
The planner is not going to deal with a town of 800 or a town of 1,200.
And we want to underline that
Yeah.
any of these programs at any of these institutions across the country are not competing
Right. In
for
fact,
the
we're-
professional
We're
aspect.
building the potential for them to
Exactly.
eventually hire the professional,
Exactly.
whether
Right.
it's a planner or an architect, a landscape architect. But I think the thing that happens is with the fee we do charge, and we've actually nudged it up over the years because it's a kind of litmus test. One helps them to organize. It helps them to understand there are resources, and no community actually follows the same path. And that empowers them in a certain way because they begin to know that money isn't the issue, it's having something to apply money toward. Money follows ideas, not the other way around. And so that gives them a way to get themselves organized, to determine that they can find resources, and that's a great tool to understand if they're ready for us to come.
I was going to ask if that's part of what you might be putting in your list, your readiness list,
Yes.
is funding sources or willingness to find them, and if that is a measure of their commitment and then readiness.
Yes, and that oftentimes if an organization has a hard time paying our fee, which is a relatively fundamental fee also, it begins to, part of the litmus test is that it's perhaps they're not ready to move ahead in certain projects. So it helps them begin to see that there are certain things that can be donated and certain things that cannot be, and how they work within that is part of the process of understanding that. The bringing in as part of the round table of discussion has to be a development officer, a fundraising person at all times. It's oftentimes a trouble to find someone who can come in so early in the process, but that's part of what we're working with now. Some organizations have the capacity to bring them in earlier than others and pay for their services. That's a little difficult. We as I said, we do charge for our services. We do have students that work with us. The one distinction between us and perhaps other university-run design centers is that we are primarily a fully professional staff with one to three students a semester to work with us. We're 12 months a year. We're not semester-based. So when a semester ends, the project continues and so on. Where some university-based centers is when the semester ends, then it's the community will see a brand new group of people, and there is a continuity of people that stays with the projects all 12 months, not just in an academic year.
That certainly helps with that scheduling of
Right.
everybody.
Exactly.
Lives. We struggle with that because we're a semester-based
Yeah.
project orientation. Two things popping up again. One is talk about the key of bringing the students into community and how it really neutralizes a lot of what we call the garbage bag filled with "we can't do this" saying, and then I'd like to lead us in after that into when you leave a project, how have you set in motion the implementation aspect. So talk about your students, and even though you are more of a
Yep.
full-time professional, you do have students involved.
Most definitely, yes.
And talk about what that
Well,
does.
we bring students as a project base. Now, our work, about a third of the projects we do have student based, and then the others are we bring professionals either as volunteers or professionals in to work on a contract basis on our projects. But the students bring not only the fresh eyes I was talking about before, but they also bring a certain naivete that's really beautiful. They don't know what won't work, particularly related
right.
to government process, politics, funding, all of those things. So the blue sky potential and the enthusiasm they have for that is really wonderful and very contagious. with the people in the community. And of course, they love the students. There's a bonding with them. And I think the other part of that is genuinely important is the students can, and I hesitate to say it exactly like this, but they can get away with saying things that a professional who's been hired and paid a big fee or is seen as an outsider in some way.
Except for Andreas Duani.
Yeah, well, that they daren't say. And sometimes that's about calling a community in a certain way on their lack of investment in a certain community, because the students can very innocently go, well, why haven't you built that park? There's a good park over in this neighborhood. Why isn't there a good park here? They can react to communities' deference about certain things in ways that make it more uncomfortable for the community, or at least insist in a certain way that they acknowledge those things that are unsaid, particularly in terms of social justice and disparity of investment in a community.
The equity issues.
Exactly, exactly.
Do you find, and you live in a community where equity is a major issue, isn't it?
And we also live in a community where every university is attempting to do a study
Well, it's not just your universities in your community, but it's Michigan State and the University of Michigan.
And Columbia and Harvard and University of Virginia and Berkeley. And so there's a delicate line, what we're dealing with, of the communities feeling like they're lab rats, frankly, and that's the words they've used, that we don't want to just continue to be studied. We want to be a part of a process. And that's what they see that we and our students are bringing, is a continued process. And so the students are seen very differently, and everything Cheryl said is exactly true. It's so wonderful to teach students, especially the students who there are certain students that begin to start being tainted by what cannot be done. But those who have not have that taintedness is really quite wonderful to deal with that naivete. We call it a naive freshness. It's really wonderful. But they come with preconceptions. And so those preconceptions, especially in our areas in the Detroit area of problems with equity, we have to work in ways that have the way each are dealing with each other in ways that help sort of break down those preconceptions in certain ways that allow for the students as well as the community to see each other in beneficial and trusting ways. There's got to be respect and trust that develop. What we actually what we say about our university and our design center and other programs like us is that we're an engagement arm of the university, not a service arm of the university, which is typically used. The engagement arm suggests that it's a two-way, multi-way street, that everyone's learning and not just one side is learning. And so the students hear that right from the beginning, that you are learning as well, and we are, everyone is learning in this process. That changes a bit, but there's that delicate line in Detroit that has to be dealt with.
I think the other thing that we find, and I'm not sure we're really good at this yet, and so we're still looking at tools for it, is particularly minority communities or impoverished communities. And in Alabama, those can be the same or different. They're on one end or the other of the spectrum. They're either so suspicious because they have been studied before, people have come and gone, nothing has really changed after plan, or they're so needy.
Yes.
The other end of the spectrum, they're so needy, so happy we're there, that they don't tell us what they really think.
Exactly.
And in a certain way, that's the one that I'm most concerned about, is how do you tell us, no, that won't work in our community. No, that might work in your suburban neighborhood where you live, but it won't work in our community. And I think that that's part of our maturing as a center that is going to be really important and requires a kind of follow-up, and maybe gets at the next thing you were asking about, what comes next.
What comes next? And I'm so glad that you all have talked about how important it is to bring the students in, and so that our viewers realize that when students come in, it isn't inexperienced. They come in backed by a tremendous amount of experiential knowledge from the professionals or the academics who are working with them. But the aspect of what they draw out of the people in the community. In fact, I'm sure you find the same thing. I just step back. The people in the community don't tend to talk to me. They are talking to
Most
the
definitely.
students, and that's the way I like it. And I just fade into the
Yeah,
to the backstory
absolutely.
because the students can engage them, and people seem to be very willing to talk to them about things that they probably would not say to any of us. And
Most definitely.
to reaffirm for everybody, other institutions around the country have similar entities that do this engagement, that using Dan's word of engagement. So we encourage people to, in communities, to make contact with their universities within their state and engage them in your community. Now, let me take to implementation, and Cheryl has brought several wonderful posters, and I'll be holding them up as
Okay.
Cheryl talks. It will block the view of her, but however,
Yeah,
I
that's
do
fine.
I do want to hold them up because what she and her students do, and I'll lay the groundwork for
Right.
Cheryl's comments, and it's rather a clever thing that they do, is part of their agreement with whatever community they go into, they put into their budget funds to produce these roughly 3x4 size posters that are duplicated many times over, and then they're put throughout the community, and as I've heard Cheryl once say, even in the barber shop. So,
Yes, yes.
so that's my lead in for implementation, and then have Dan talk about different ways they have been going about this. So let me
Well,
hold these up, and so we can show this while Cheryl is talking about.
this is one of those things that was a kind of happy accident, I think, that we began to realize that in communities, when we produced a pamphlet or a book or a notebook, a year later we knew exactly where they were. They were in a
Collecting dust.
file cabinet or in on a shelf. And for the same amount of money, and they were also black and white and pretty uninspiring. And we had all these beautiful drawings that for the same amount of money, we could produce in quantities of about 5,000 these posters that are a snapshot of the plan. Now, it forced us to be succinct in what we told them because you can't put it all on a poster this size. But they are distributed to every household. They go up in the shops, they go up in the city hall, they go up in the churches, they go up at the schools. And it's a kind of accountability. You walk by it when you go to the post office and you go, yes, that's what we said we were going to do. The other thing that happened with these is we purposely designed them so that they fold down to 8.5 by 11. So they go right behind a grant application into a package for promotion or recruiting for the community. And they get distributed to your state legislature. They get distributed to people in Washington. And we encourage communities, mail them to everybody you can think of. And then because they're pretty, and that's a word that we architects and designers kind of cringe at, but we purposely make them very visually friendly because we really do think a picture's worth 1,000 words. People get engaged. They go, oh, could our community look like this? And then the people they mail them to, they end up on the wall. And so they're on the wall in their state legislature representative's office. They end up on the wall in places where people are coming and going. And we've had, half a dozen communities now where we've found out that someone came into a senator's office and they went, oh, my grandparents grew up in that community. And suddenly they've got a way to get involved again with the community in a way the community couldn't have found them necessarily. One of the great ones that we have right now is a woman who is the Economic Development Officer for the county that Aspen, Colorado's in, is now making regular trips back to Moundville, Alabama, because she saw a poster up in an office and her family is from that part of Alabama. And so these forces that began to be engaged because there's something that people can connect with. So the posters have been a really powerful tool for us, and I think they've made a huge difference in the potential for a community to say, this is what we're planning.
Take it to that step
Yeah.
of implementation that we talked about. And for our viewers, Cheryl has brought these copies of several posters. We didn't show them all. And they will be in the City Planning Landscape Architecture Library. So always, as I remind everybody, you're citizens of the state of Illinois and you have access to use the university library, and you can go to the library and look at these as examples of how we can display ideas for your communities. Dan, I want to also remind our viewers that Dan's group has done a very intriguing video about their projects, and it is in the University Library collection. It will be found in our media center, but again, you can certainly go and look at that and talk about that, because it covers a lot of your projects and another way of getting that information out. And are you finding this also a way of taking that next step to implementation? In other words, reminding people these are things you've said.
Yes, and I wanted to actually say that in relationship to also that I think it's very important that the posters that we make, the booklets, we are visual people, and the designers, the people, and that one of our expertise is not just design, but how to bring that design to touch people's hearts. And I think what's so clear in that video isn't just the projects, but how that those projects touch people, and how they've engaged in the making of the projects, and then also once the projects are completed, whether it's a doorknob in a room to a city plan or a neighborhood plan. And so people do not fund words, they fund things that touch them in their heart. And so we create booklets, we create posters. The video has been very helpful to the organizations that we've had locally, because it shows, well, I should say many architects and planners and landscape folks do not usually take video of their work. They usually show very still images, and so we're essentially brought to believe that. And so when you have booklets and so on, they are stills. What this video starts showing is how people really engage the work, and that's how they've engaged the process of making it, but engage it once it is built. One particular project was Mercy Education Project that's shown in the video, where the walls were 3 feet thick, because it's engaging children that are from elementary school up to young adults, and how the children now are accessing, and the intention was that children would be inside the wall learning, not just in the classroom. So people now see that happening, and they say, oh, I want to be more part of that kind of project. So it touches people more here and not just up here.
Well, and the other thing that we've found, we've developed a number of what we call sort of social organizing videos, 12 to 15 minutes long. Your video is a little bit longer than that, but I think probably could be used in the same way, that we show them at the beginning of a meeting, and what that begins to do is break down those barriers for conversation, because they actually see some things. So your video uses that. Posters can do somewhat the same thing, that you see what has happened in other communities, so that shyness of community residents to say, gee, I really would like.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And they see that, okay, what I would like maybe is a real aspect.
That process right now.
Oh, are you? Okay, talk about
the
that.
The video artists that made the video are Sherry Blake and Tadashi Ori from Canada, and they've made one long video, which is approximately an hour. That's now that's at the University Library. But we're in the process of making these discrete segments that help explain or engage people for particular topics, and that's quite important, because we've been extracting out of that video things for exactly the purpose that you mentioned. And we said it would be so much nicer if we actually had a complete set of saying, this is for working on this condition, this is for working with that condition, and so on.
Or
so
if you're going in to do a charrette, and it's hard to explain What
What are you gonna do?
What, explain a
What is
charrette.
charrette?
Exactly.
Everybody says, this is
What
the
is
first
this?
time I've heard this
Right.
word, but we're working very hard so for it to
Exactly.
become a common language. I'm sure you
Yes.
use charrette. So
Oh,
yes.
what do you
All the time.
talk about charrette?
We say it's about rolling up your sleeves and working really hard on a discrete problem for a short period of time.
Nice way.
Yeah.
How do you describe it when you go in?
Actually, very much the same way. It's how to create bring what the essence of everybody, what's up here in the mind, down on paper in a very short period of time. It's not about details, trying to get what we feel and what we desire out on paper in a short period of time.
And no idea is wrong. No idea.
There's no, we
Yeah.
truly
And
live by
nothing
that.
is
Right.
too far
Right.
out. It's,
Well, and
it's your
we
time
talk
to-
about that
Right.
getting it down is not. We're not working with our wrists. We're working from the
Yes.
elbow and the shoulder. It's about that sort of energy level that comes from people working together
some
around
really
the table.
Right.
big ideas. And when you do that, what do you find happens? Talk about that a bit. So people aren't, reticent to come in and say something that they're afraid their neighbor is going to say, "Oh, John, really? You know we tried that 10 years ago." How do you?
Well, I think that, again, when the students are involved, it does help with that because there are new people to hear the old stories.
Okay.
There's a willing audience, that notion of engagement. We really do want to hear what they have to say. And we try very hard in ours. It's back to there's no wrong idea. That everyone a lot of times really does just want to be heard. And we write down everyone's ideas in our meetings.
And the way they state it, not an interpretation thereof, right?
Well, and we do both actually.
Oh, okay.
Because one of the ways we try to keep people from talking about the negative in their community is to say, well, if you tell us that you need a stop sign at this intersection, we're going to know that, but we're also going to write down study traffic patterns because
Oh, good
it
idea.
really may not be that we need a stop sign at that intersection, despite what you think. It may be that there's a problem 4 blocks away that's causing that problem at that intersection.
Or a redesign of the corner might
Right,
do
right.
it.
Or, who knows.
Right.
So we try to give them both perspectives, an acknowledgement that
Good
we
idea.
value what they said, but also
Okay.
the notion that specificity at this point is not going to help us get to the answer unless we understand the larger
Exactly.
context. So that, again, we're back to that notion of helping them see things from another point of view is often one of the most important things we bring. And we tell them a lot of times, this is just common sense stuff we're doing. We're trained to draw, but your thinking is as good as our thinking. And as you begin to see that there are choices, that there are alternatives, people are often very and much more creative than we are at knowing how to solve the problems in their community. It's them knowing that there isn't a single way to do it.
And are you
Yes.
finding a similar experience that you...
Most definitely. Even the example I would like to give is we were working on a park design for Southwest Detroit, and the community kept asking, they wanted to surround it by a fence. They wanted to surround it. And we could not figure out why they wanted to surround it by a fence. So the process we've designed allows for questions upon questions that help get to what those larger ideas are behind their specific ideas. And what came out of that was that they continuously have folks that are driving through the park, up the curve and through the park and doing 360. So what we needed
the
to do.
danger aspect.
So that and the they didn't want to put anything new. Would rip up the park. So essentially we said, okay, well that can be done through many other ways than surrounding it by a fence, because with surrounding something by a fence, you've now stopped access to the park. You've made it feel like there's a line between the park and the people who could use the park. So but we also, every process we start, we ask for we only have 2 ground rules. The 2 ground rules have 2 parts, but the first is do not be afraid of conflict, but also do not be afraid of resolution. And we constantly say that there's in that discussion that we have to be willing to disagree, but we have to also be willing to have sort of agreements and discussions within that disagreement. And at the same and the other ground rule is do not speak to be heard, as well as listen to those who are speaking. Those are the only ground rules we have. And then from that point on, it's actually even that saying that, then we can say, if you're stopping, so well, we've heard that 10 years ago. We said, no, these folks have not listened to that person who's speaking. We can always tie it back to in some way.
Very good ideas. Now, about how long, I know there's no set pattern, but just to give our viewers an idea that this doesn't happen in a week and this doesn't happen in a day. Right. Maybe it even takes a year or two. Talk about that, because sometimes it's hard to keep people engaged for a long time. What are you finding?
Well, I think that they are always impatient. They want to see things immediately. And one of our jobs is to help find things that they can see immediately. And sometimes that's maybe only a community cleanup or a new welcome sign for the town, new sense of momentum in the community. Okay. But then to begin to understand that many of the plans and ideas have to be done incrementally over a longer period of time. Okay. They've got to build partnerships often. It's not something that they're going to necessarily be able to do with the local resources. And I think that they need some sense of on-the-ground capacity building in most of the communities we work in. They're by and large volunteer oriented. They have part-time mayors. Maybe the only paid person in the community is the city manager, the city clerk, and the police chief. And so they need some tools for capacity building. And we encourage them to develop a community development corporation, become a Main Street program. There are lots of tools out there. And then to begin to look at the resources that they have, like their regional planning commissions, the universities, the expertise. But I think that they have to have some immediate successes to begin to get a sense of possibility in the community.
And to remind folks that Cheryl mentioned community development corporations and Main Street programs. Doing some Googling on the internet, you will find such for each of your states. So when she mentioned those, without being specific, you can fairly easily find some additional information on how to make those contacts. Dan, do you find similar aspects?
Exactly. We are constantly up against the desire to have something done tomorrow, and though also the understanding that it's going to take many, many years. In Detroit has been declining since the 1920s. So what we see has been happening for 80 years. So most people understand it's not going to change tomorrow, but they want at the same time for it to change tomorrow. So we have to find things that can occur in a day's notice, if you will, and one things that will happen in 10 and 15 years. So two examples that I would like to give. Ones are very similar to what Cheryl has brought up, is neighborhood cleanups, things that bring community members together and to help help organization and capacity building in ways that typically may not have happened before in the past. Out of one that's a little bit more unusual that I will be showing later tomorrow is a project that we call Fire Break. It grew out of community meeting on the east side of Detroit, where the students had worked on a master plan for the area. And the community loved what was being presented. They said, but this is wonderful, but what can we do tomorrow? We have burned houses. Incidentally, there are 8,000 burned houses within the city of Detroit. What can we do to change that burned house that's right next to my property? I have one next to my property. What can I do? And my background is also in installation art, so I brought up the ideas, why don't we this weekend get together and do an installation in that burned house, change it from a blight on the physical landscape and the mental landscape to a piece of art, to an asset. So what we ended up doing was putting a local band inside the house, and we covered all the windows with a yellow fabric, so you couldn't see the band, but you could hear the band. So suddenly it became a music box. We took another house in that area and covered it with 3,000 little bales of hay, because that area of Detroit has so much vacant land, it's actually become urban farming is beginning to develop. So we began to celebrate what was there. So the other thing about this burned house project is it begins to offer an alternative to houses entirely demolishing them, or do you what do you do with if they're too far gone to make them into something that's inhabitable as a house? So now the projects are trying to do things that are a bit more permanent, not so temporary. So we're making one into a stage. That'll be an exterior community stage that will be more permanent. But it's not. It's not being torn down, but it's not being renovated back into a house. It's sort of in the middle.
You just to tie in your last comments, you both are talking about assets. Even though that burned house looks like it definitely is not an asset, you have gotten people to turn around, and there is. And you both know this, the Asset-Based Community Development Institute at Northwestern. And I mentioned that because they did some very interesting discoveries in the work they did in the poorer areas in Chicago, and discovered hundreds, literally hundreds, of organizations that were unofficial. Mrs. Smith may only be brought in when Mrs. Jones' house burns down, because they know Mrs. Smith has these boxes of clothes in the basement, and they go to her only at that. She's not official. She's very unofficial. And so these are other wonderful aspects that when we go into the communities, they know they exist, but we discovered them because we don't know all of this exists.
Exactly.
Before we close, I want to ask you both to give out how to find you. The best and most simple ways to find you on the internet. Cheryl, a couple of your websites.
Actually, the university's website, the School of Architecture, we are in the process of building a new website for the Urban Studio, because we realized that we're not really celebrating all the towns and communities. We were much more focused on teaching and the students, and the notion that we need to be letting our work link to all these towns and communities.
Right, your 40 projects.
Yes, absolutely. And then the Your Town, Alabama, that I told you about, has some information about our work, and that's a sister organization that we're very proud of having helped found, and the impact that it's having in Alabama.
But to underline, even though the new website isn't started for the Urban Studio, again, if you are on the internet and you do a search and you do Urban Studio Auburn University, you will get to a website that isn't as extensive as Cheryl has indicated it will be, but you will get some background information. Dan, I know you have quite an extensive website.
Yes, but it's also about 4 years old, so we have to update it, and we're in that process.
That's the problem with websites. They go up and then you say, oh my goodness, they have to be kept up to date.
And since I'm the one that actually does our own website, that it takes some time. The best way to find us, it's sort of curious that our physical location has also made our website seem quite difficult to find. So it's a very long website address. The best way to get to our website is to go to our School of Architecture, which is S as in Sam, OA.udmercy.edu. And then once you get to that, that's the homepage of our School of Architecture website, and then there's a button to click that says Detroit Collaborative Design Center. That's the best way to get to us, as opposed to giving us our direct web.
And if for some reason you are better with just remembering words,
yes,
you can do, again, a search on the internet, and if you put in Detroit Collaborative Design Center, it will come up at the top of the list, and clicking on that, and then that will lead you into Dan and the center's website. I want to thank both of you. This has been a tremendously stimulating conversation and very encouraging for communities to make contact with their institutions and engage the students in working toward developing a community that we always describe as one you would want to live in and one you would want to stay in. And remember, planning matters.